This is the work session. That's fine. Work session of the Portland City Council today. We're here to talk about our federal and our state legislative agendas. Today's date is the 15th already of November 2018. Good morning, Director.
Good morning. Good morning, Mayor Wheeler, Commissioner Fritz, Commissioner Fish. For the record, Elizabeth Edwards, Director of the Office of Government Relations. My team and I are really pleased to be here this morning and to bring you the first draft of the city's 2019 state and federal legislative agendas. So we're hoping to have a conversation this morning. We will, and please feel free to ask questions, interrupt along the way. What we're going to do, and for viewers at home, we will be posting the draft agendas in this PowerPoint also to our website, which can be found at www.portlandoregon.gov/OGR for the Office of Government Relations. So today, we're going to start with the federal agenda, and then we'll go to the state. In each instance, we're going to lay some groundwork. We're going to talk about where we've been, discuss recent accomplishments, and look ahead, get a sense of the lay of the land, in large part informed by the recent midterm election. And then with that context, we'll dive into the key issues before Congress, our federal regulatory agencies, and the state legislature, and talk about the draft city priorities. So that's the plan for this morning. So with that, allow me to introduce Vicki Cram, our DC representative, Niels Tillstrom, our federal relations manager, Eric Knoll, our associate, who does double duty on state and federal relations.
Thanks, Eric.
So before digging too deep in, I want to note one change to the title even of the federal agenda, which is now the Federal Legislative and Regulatory Agenda. So that change is in recognition of the work that we can still accomplish by working with and through federal agencies, and I'll touch a little bit more on that later. We began the process of developing this agenda back in August, and we solicited input from bureaus and from council offices, and since then we've been working to refine the concepts for their inclusion in the agendas. Am I not hitting it? Okay, thank you, Commissioner. Every year I struggle with this microphone.
So does everybody else.
Okay.
It's not you.
I don't come up here all that often.
We can't afford to have another technology upgrade.
There we go.
Please.
I think I need to be just a couple inches taller, too.
Well, that might work.
Well, yeah, that ship sailed. So we've been working on refining the concepts that were submitted by your bureaus and by council offices, have been talking and working very closely with our congressional delegation and, of course, with bureau leadership to help refine the concepts that are in here. And a big thank you to also our legislative liaisons. We have liaisons in all of the bureaus and council offices, and they do yeoman's work to help refine policies, get us feedback, and for the smallest bureau in the city, it helps us have a reach for the entire city. So we're really appreciative of everything that they do. Now, before I turn things over to Vicki to do the exciting lay of the land post-midterm election, I'm going to take a quick walk through memory lane and do a review of some federal accomplishments, because I think sometimes we can feel really down about the state of affairs at the federal level, and there is still work that we can do and are doing. So the three slides that follow are on funding, collaboration, and good old-fashioned lobbying. So this slide on funding is a snapshot. It shows some of the grants and other funding sources we've been able to tap into over the last year, and it is by no means exhaustive, but it shows over $20 million worth of funding opportunities that have come in on resilience, public safety, economic development, housing, homelessness, and more. So this is part of the reason why we are still calling out and regulatory, or why we are especially calling out and regulatory as part of our federal agenda this year. The next slide on collaboration, highlighting the work that we are doing with our partners.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
On the funding slide, is the $1.41 million for HOPWA, which is Housing Opportunities for Persons Living with AIDS, Is that an entitlement grant or is that a discretionary grant?
It's a formula. Commissioner, it's a formula grant.
So we get something similar to that every year, and then we partner with Cascades AIDS Project, or we have
Correct.
historically with Cascade AIDS Project? Good, that's good to know, because the majority of the council will be joining CAP, I think on December 5th, World AIDS Day, to accept an award, and this is one of the two ways that we interact with CAP, I think, as giving them this as a pass-through, so thank you.
So on the next slide for collaboration, by working collaboratively and building coalitions, we're able to elevate Portland amongst our peers and also amplify our voice on the extra-regional level and the national levels. So it highlights some of the work that we've done with organizations like U.S. Conference of Mayors or the Mayors Innovation Project, different partnerships that we've helped build, like the West Coast Alliance, and individual outreach that we've helped facilitate that help to distinguish Portland and continue to raise our profile as a leader and innovator. And we've been working on a wide array of topics, from climate change, again, housing and homelessness, autonomous vehicles, any manner of things. The final accomplishment slides talks about advocacy. So last but not least, it's the good old-fashioned lobbying, going to Capitol Hill, going to our federal agencies, building on those partnerships, letters to the delegation that help arm them with the on-the-ground impacts of federal policies, and of course, working with our delegation for appropriation opportunities, since we are working in an earmark-free environment still. So with that, our work calls upon us to be ever more creative because of the changing federal landscape, but we use a blend of techniques in order to be effective in a very interesting environment. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Vicki to talk a little bit about this interesting environment we're working in.
Good morning, Mayor and Commissioners. For the record, I'm Vicki Cram. I'm principal at Squire Patton Boggs in Washington, D.C. Well, we had an election, and I like to call this gridlock plus opportunities. So in the House, the Democrats picked up, and we're still counting some seats, so we don't know the final number, but over 30 seats, bringing the total to somewhere around 228 right now to 197. And Kevin McCarthy has already been elected by his caucus as the minority leader. And Speaker Pelosi has a little bit of a challenge to get to being Speaker Pelosi, but I think probably she will be named Speaker, and it'll be the same team as it was in the minority, which would be Nancy Pelosi, and then Steny Hoyer, and then Jim Clyburn. I think notable in what's happened in the House is the diversity of the incoming freshman class. They're diverse in terms of gender, they're diverse in terms of race, they're diverse in terms of religion, and many of them have never held elective office before. So
I believe that applies to the Democratic incoming.
to the Democratic
Because if you
incoming,
look at the incoming Republican newbies, that is not the case.
correct. And so how that will play out in terms of how they work with the speaker will be very interesting to watch. Even though we have an influx of a lot of new members on both sides of the aisle of Congress, some really trusted and steady hands will be on the tiller, particularly at the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, where Congressman Peter DeFazio, who has been the ranking minority member, will take over the chairmanship in all likelihood, and also at the Ways and Means Committee, where Congressman Neal will take it over.
Could I ask you a question?
Yes.
Congressman DeFazio has been particularly outspoken with regard to tolling, which we have discussed as a council, and he's been particularly outspoken in opposition to tolling. Where do you think that leaves our strategies with regard to congestion management, and does that change our strategy?
I think I think that remains to be seen. I think it may change, we may have to change our strategy. He has been, I think, maybe a little less emphatic about it, just in recent conversations with him and recent exchanges. So,
How recent?
when was that?
There was a news report in the last week. Sorry. Neil Stillstrom, Office of Government Relations, Federal Relations Manager. The congressman had sent a letter to Oregon Department of Transportation regarding a construction project in Eugene, and in that, he mentioned ODOT's work in tolling, and he had had a recent conversation with ODOT. And while he continued to express concern in the letter, he laid out what it would take for tolling to be successful, in that it wouldn't impact low-income folks in a desperate way. So there is, he definitely will play a role in this continuing conversation, but I think that he signaled a little room there because the Oregon legislature had acted on this, and ODOT is pursuing this as a strategy. So he's putting his marker out there, but he is going to be the chairman of the T&I committee, and there will potentially be a surface transportation bill that he'll oversee. So,
Could I get a copy of the letter that
Sure.
he sent you? I haven't read it.
so
I'd like to
this
read
was sent to ODOT. Yeah, we
it.
can
Okay,
get a copy
great.
of that.
Thank you.
To continue, in the Senate, Republicans will keep the majority. 2 seats are still outstanding, Florida, which should be resolved potentially this weekend, and Mississippi, in which there is going to be a runoff in a couple of weeks. And so the Republicans will probably end up at 53, which is a pickup of 2 seats over the current Congress. And that's good for the president in continuing to approve judges and for easily replacing, leaving, or suggested that they should leave cabinet secretaries. And the majority leader will remain Mitch McConnell. And the win gives him a bit more leverage, but of course, he still needs 60 votes to get most things done in the Senate. And I think.
Could you explain something that we heard last night? And I don't understand the procedure, but Senator Flake said that because he was blocked in getting a vote on the floor of the Senate on his Mueller protection law, he would block all future judicial nominees through the Judiciary Committee. How does he do that?
Well, in the Senate, one senator can block any activities there. So he has no doubt placed a hold on the judicial nominations.
But if they can't get a majority vote of the Judiciary Committee, can it still be discharged to the full Senate floor for debate?
It can be. There's, I think, a 1-vote margin in the Judiciary Committee, in the Senate Judiciary Committee.
But the way it was reported in the press was that he could effectively stall the judicial nomination process until he gets action on what he wants to do to protect the special counsel. I mean, is that generally true?
I
Or?
think that's generally true.
Okay. Thank you.
So notable in the Senate will be the number of particularly Democratic senators who will be running for president, and that will be an interesting thing to watch, because I think there are probably 7 or 8 of them that are considering that. So I'm going to move on from the makeup of the Congress to our congressional delegation, which will remain unchanged on the Senate side in terms of probably their committee assignments, and certainly with Senator Ron Wyden remaining ranking member on the Senate Finance Committee. And on the House side, the one change will be that Congressman Greg Walden will go from being chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee to ranking member, and as we already mentioned, Congressman DeFazio will go from ranking member to chairman of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and that's significant because I think one of the opportunities we will have in the coming year is on infrastructure, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. I want to discuss a little bit very briefly the accomplishments of the 115th Congress, and in particular the last year, and then move on to what we can see happening in the lame duck, and then from there what we can expect in the 116th Congress. So This past year, there was passage of the Federal Aviation Administration reauthorization. It is the first 5-year, long-term, $90 billion authorization, which is the longest reauthorization for the FAA since Congress passed one in 1980. And the legislation addresses industry workforce programs, aviation safety, and drone integration. And it did not include the privatization of the air traffic control system. Congress also passed and the President signed a reauthorization of the Comprehensive Water Resources Development Act, which governs the Army Corps of Engineers projects such as flood controls, levees, waterways, et cetera. And it also included in that legislation the Drinking Water Improvement Act, which authorizes some grant programs, small grant programs, and provides financing opportunities to assist communities to improve their drinking water, particularly revolving around lead and in response to Flint.
Vicki, why isn't the Water Resources Development Act, WRDA, called out specifically in our federal legislative and regulatory agenda? And it does, if we are in line to get funding for the third project, why isn't it called out specifically?
It is. It's just not mentioned by name. It appears, it's on page 9 is the Willamette River Restoration Projects.
So can we throw WRDA in there,
Yeah,
and for my colleagues' benefit, we've received, and we have a champion in Congressman Schrader in the third of a suite of requests that we did. But we just completed Oaks Bottom. The next one is Tryon Creek, and it is a sterling example of a partnership with the Army Corps of Engineers, the Bureau of Environmental Services, and Portland Parks and Rec. And are we actually in the bill that the President signed?
So the project, the Lower Willamette River Ecosystem Restoration Project, was an authorized project in the 2016 WRDA bill. So we've moved past the WRDA process, and now we're in the appropriations process. So for this particular project, Tryon Creek, we will have to be engaging the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, and the Army Corps of Engineers directly to get funding for that project. We've worked with our delegation. Senator Merkley last year was able to insert language into a Senate appropriations bill to direct the Corps to prioritize funding for a project like this. It was sort of a soft earmark, as we like to call it. And then we are going to be engaging Congressman Schrader in the same exercise for this year. So with respect to this project, we've moved beyond the WRDA piece because it's an authorizing bill, and now we're going after appropriations.
Okay, all I would ask is that we just elevate the profile of that particular
Absolutely.
project.
Absolutely.
It's been conspicuously successful, and I think that ball's now in Congress. I think Congressman Schrader becomes particularly helpful.
Yeah.
Yes.
In getting this money, so that perhaps next year we can begin to do the preliminary work on Tryon Creek.
Absolutely.
And welcome juvenile salmon back to Tryon Creek.
Yes, exactly. And WRDA is an every 2-year authorization. There was a moment in time when there were 7 years passed between authorizations, but now they're back on an every 2-year cycle for the WRDA program. And so Congress also passed the Support Act, which incorporates a wide range of provisions to address the nation's opioid epidemic. And the measure largely modifies Medicare and Medicaid policies to better prevent and combat the crisis. Generally, other provisions seek to expand comprehensive substance use disorder treatment, particularly at the local level, and address associated health workforce shortages. So that was just signed into law, and they will be implementing their rules and regulations around that, and we will be keeping a very close eye on that for the city. The FY19 appropriations process, this year Congress vowed to return to regular order, and with some success, both chambers passed all 12 of their spending bills out of committee. By the time of their adjournment for the elections, Congress had approved its second minibus, which included the 2 largest spending bills, which was the one for the Departments of Labor, Health, Human Services, and Education, and they paired that with Defense, which is a very popular bill, must pass, and that went through. And there was a previous one with some of the easy, non-controversial bills, a previous minibus that went through a little bit earlier. Which brings us into the lame duck session, which began this week The key issue to be resolved in the lame duck are the remaining appropriations bills, which include some of the bills that we most care about, like the Commerce Justice State Bill, which has all the Department of Justice programs in it, and the Interior and Environment Bill, which has a lot of the EPA programs in it, and the Transportation HUD Program Bill, which has a lot of our CDBG, home, Tiger grants. These were held up due to disputes over the border wall funding and contentious policy riders included in the House versions of these bills. So the key thing in this conversation that we'll be having the next couple of weeks will be the border wall. And the president has asked for $5 billion. The House gave him $5 billion for the wall. And then the Senate only gave him $1.2 billion. And he has made noises, he's made comments about shutting down the federal government over full funding for the border wall. And he is less likely to get funding in the House next year with the Democrats in control, so this may be where he really takes a stand. So we may see a partial government shutdown. Right now, the federal government that are not in those bills that were passed before they adjourned is operating on a continuing resolution that ends on December 7th. So we're either going to see maybe a deal, which could be border wall funding for DACA, the Deferred Action of Childhood Arrivals, which is now only operating courtesy of the courts. They came very close to that deal earlier this year. Or potentially a partial shutdown, or they may just decide to kick it into the next Congress and have the next Congress deal with it and do a continuing resolution until, say, March. Also to be considered in the lame duck session is the National Flood Insurance Program. Expires on November 30th. The program is massively in debt. It's very complicated. It gets worse every time there's another natural disaster that involves flooding. And, you know, the decision is sort of how to provide that insurance, how much should be private, how much should be federal, and, you know, what will be the impacts on people's insurance rates. So this will also likely be kicked into the next Congress. The Farm Bill also has to be resolved. The House version of the Farm Bill has work requirements for people on the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, the SNAP program, food stamp program. I think they're very close to a resolution on that right now. And then there may be tax extenders taken up. There are always tax provisions that expire at the end of the year. Some expired at the end of 2017, more expire at the end of this year. They often will retroactively extend those expiring tax provisions. So that may well happen in the lame duck session or early next year. And then the one legislation that we've been particularly active on is legislation regarding autonomous vehicles. It's called the AV START Act. We've been working with our senators, with Senator Feinstein, with other cities to try to change language regarding local governments who have concerns over preemption of local authority, particularly around safety and also on data collection.
So I want to put into the record here, because I was admonished the last time that I neglected to put this into the record. We know this technology is coming, and there are both economic opportunities, but there are also potentially some economic challenges, particularly around workforce. And so it's important that every step we ask the question about workforce, about planning for workforce, about planning for transitioning workforce where it's required, about training for workforce where that is required. And I just think it's very, very important that we put that there alongside other considerations around AV.
Understood.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, and also funding for transit.
Correct.
Because I see a great potential for vastly increased congestion, just like there's lots more cars on the roads now because of Uber and Lyft and the other TNCs. So at the same time, if we're going to be having even more low occupancy vehicles, we need to figure out how to entice more people onto transit.
So moving into what we anticipate seeing in the 116th Congress, the budget will be a big issue, particularly at the beginning of the year when they try to wrestle with that. Right now, we have some dates up there just for your edification as to what sort of some of the deadlines are. The deadlines don't often mean very much with the congressional budget process. So we are in a situation where we have an increase in the deficit of 17% over this time last year. Sequestration returns absent any kind of a budget agreement next year. That's across the board, cuts for both domestic and defense spending. The debt ceiling will need to be raised in about March. The Treasury Department can play with the numbers and do what they call extraordinary measures. So June would probably be the end of the deadline for that. If they don't raise the debt ceiling, the nation defaults. So how that gets resolved, I think at this point is going to be, it's hard to predict right now. But presumably there will be another budget agreement like there have been in the last couple of years, which set overall spending levels and stave off sequestration. Earmarks may return in the coming Congress, appropriations earmarks. It was discussed last year in the Republican caucus when they were organizing at the beginning of the year, and there were clearly the votes to pass bringing back earmarks. But Speaker Ryan at the time decided that that was not a good, the optics weren't good for that. It will come up again in the Democratic caucus, and they will need to decide in the House whether they want to do that. Earmarks have been something that the city has used extraordinarily well, very responsibly, very transparently. It helps move legislation through. It sort of greases the wheels of moving legislation through. So that remains to be seen. I'm just looking up here. Other issues that we see, potentially immigration reform, again, some sort of a package that might be around DACA and the wall. Medicare and Social Security, the Majority Leader in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, has talked about Medicare and Social Security being reviewed in order to sort of balance the deficit, but I don't think that's probably where he's going to go. I know that the Democratic House will insist on not rolling back pre-existing conditions, and they will be exploring drug pricing. The House will likely pass a bill to allow Medicare to negotiate drug prices. Whether that goes to the Senate and what the Senate does with that and what the administration does that, the president, it remains to be seen. And there will be continued attention to the opioid crisis. Campaign finance reform, many states have passed campaign finance reform measures in this last election, so that may be something along with ethics that the speaker, whoever the speaker may be, might want to bring up. Gun violence, again, will have some movement in the House, but probably won't move in the Senate. It would probably be extending background checks, thinking about regulating semi-automatic weapons, funding some gun violence research.
Can I ask you a question? It's sort of tangential to campaign finance reform, but Phil Kiesling was on NBC News recently, the nightly news, talking about vote by mail. In light of the conversation around voter suppression and also just the scandal of this state-by-state system of antiquated machines that, I mean, here we are, we still can't say how many congressional seats have been decided. There's still, and there's recounts and there's claims of machine failure and other things. Is there a likelihood, in your opinion, in the next few years that Congress will try to federalize the election process and try something like a national vote-by-mail requirement?
I don't see that happening, certainly not in this next Congress.
Okay.
And then the big issue is the infrastructure spending issue. This is where we may not get gridlock. We may have an opportunity. The president is a builder. He campaigned on infrastructure. The Democrats are very interested in pursuing this in a very broad way. The Democrats would like to include affordable housing, which would be very important to us, in a broader package, water and sewer, broadband, et cetera. I think the Senate would probably like a more streamlined bill. The FAST Act, which is the surface transportation reauthorization, comes due in 2020. And so this would be a place where both the Democrats and Republicans could come together before the presidential election year. One of the issues always with infrastructure spending is how do you pay for it? And it's been untenable to raise the gas tax in recent years, well, in 20 years, just those recently. But Chairman Schuster, who's the retiring chairman of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, sort of laid out a blueprint, even though he won't be here to act on it, where you raise gas taxes for a finite period of time while you transition to another kind of user fee, which would probably be the vehicle miles traveled fee. So that may generate some funds that may allow this bill to move forward.
Can I ask you a question? And I don't want to put any words in our senior senator's mouth, but he worked very hard on the Build America bonds
Yes.
during the ARA. And to my thinking, they were very successful, particularly in the state of Oregon. And I'm wondering if, and I've heard him muse from time to time about potentially returning to a model similar to that. Is there any momentum for that, or do we have a sense?
I think there is some momentum for that. I had a meeting with the speaker's, the incoming speaker, if she is elected speaker's staff last week, and they were talking about taking the low-income housing tax credit model and transitioning that to be a model for infrastructure.
So
I think there's a lot of creativity that will be on the table and will be explored.
Good, and I'm pleased to hear that. My recollection was there was something like 55 projects around the state of Oregon that were funded by that program at the height of the recession, and they were desperately needed and critical infrastructure projects.
Yes.
But I remember one of the hangups in retrospect was that those projects had to be shovel-ready. And if we think that there is a bipartisan move towards investing in infrastructure, we need to be prepared for the same possibility that the standard for awarding those infrastructure dollars will be shovel readiness. So I want to make sure that we're working here locally to get our project list together in the event that those dollars are freed up. I do not want us to get caught with our collective pants down on this. I mean, we know what the experience was last time, and I agree with you. I'm thinking this may be the big bipartisan push in this upcoming legislative session. I just want to make sure we're being aggressive about it.
And I think the same would be true if earmarks were to come back. This would be a bill that would be heavily earmarked,
Yeah.
potentially,
Well,
as
one of the-
used to be in the past.
And I'm a little rusty on this, but I mean, really, the area where we have the biggest infrastructure spending outside of transportation is the utilities. And if you take the reservoirs, if you take the tunnel underneath Willamette, if you take the filtration plant, if you start adding them up, you take the rebuild of the Columbia wastewater facility, you're talking now, I don't know, approaching $1 billion or something over a period of time. My recollection is that the Build America bond program did not have a lot of application to us because we already, with our credit history, were able to get such favorable terms in the private market that the strings attached to the federal program did not make it more attractive than our normal borrowing. I'd actually like to have that flushed out by someone. It may be that we need to do a combination, but with every federal program comes a lot of strings. And the low-income housing tax credit program is not working very well right now because of the president's tax bill.
Correct.
So it may be that it is better suited to things like transportation projects because of the different capacity to access private markets that transportation has versus the utilities. But my recollection is the utilities may not be the preferred place to look for Build America because we already have access to rock bottom interest rate financing through the private markets. So I think it's something we need to take a look at.
We will, absolutely.
Well, I'd rather err on the side of being prepared and then disappointed later.
Well, we
I
did.
still
We
think need
actually
to
went
go
through this
the
whole exercise,
of
Mayor.
putting together a project list and seeing where we want to prioritize and what our sources of funding are. And if it turns out down the road that we have a favorable bond rating here that makes it cost competitive for us to issue our own bonds, then we're with the status quo, which is great. But let's prepare this time. That's all I'm saying. Why wouldn't we?
We did get $500 million from the Obama stimulus in 2009.
Correct.
And that was, you're right, Mayor, that was, we had to have the projects being shovel-ready, so I think that the Tillicum Bridge was one of them. But it was mostly it was
Well, both
not
our
the
comments got some.
Yeah, it was not the utilities, you're right, too. It was...
Utilities didn't.
Yeah. So I guess that what you're saying is we need to be thinking in our budget process of the planning part. So
Let's assume the best.
Yeah.
And get moving on our planning, and that requires my bureaus to act as well. I mean, the Housing Bureau also needs to do an assessment. If we suddenly believe there's additional capital dollars available for affordable housing, we better have a list ready to go.
Yeah.
What properties, where, how do we develop them, who are our partners, and make sure they're as close to ready to go. And it could be that at the end of the day, we're disappointed. But to quote the old quote, planning is everything, plans are nothing. Let's do the planning.
Absolutely, Mayor. The last topic on this slide is the potential for revisiting tax reform potentially. There will probably be a technical corrections bill of the tax cut bill because, you know, they sometimes forget to dot i's and everything. There's been some talk of a middle class tax bill. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand mentioned that, brought up a bill at the end of the session, and the president has mentioned it, even though he surprised, I think, a lot of people in the Treasury Department when he did that. So there may be some activity on tax cuts. The House this year passed Tax 2.0, which would make permanent the parts of the tax cut bill that weren't permanent, which would be for individuals and small businesses.
Vicki, who knew that the cap on state and local taxes that made its way into the president's plan would create a blue wave in Orange County, California?
It's true.
I was watching that last night. It was like the one place you would least expect Democrats to do well, and apparently that was the tipping point.
Deciding factor.
My daughter voted there. Really exciting, three flips.
Our
in
last
Irvine.
slide are key regulatory issues. There has been a lot of activity on the regulatory side. We have made comments when there have been comment periods, and we have also litigated in some of these, and all of these issues, except for the last one, opportunity zones, are in the courts in some way or another. And so they include telecommunications, small cell siting, and in-kind cable television, transgender rights, the 2020 census citizenship question, which has, I think, 20 lawsuits, the Endangered Species Act, the auto emissions, which have been rolled back by the administration proposed, and the proposed repeal of the Clean Power Plan. Those comments just closed on October 30th. And then, of course, opportunity zones, which was one of the few high points for local governments in the tax cut bill, creating opportunity zones, which the state designated, wherein people can invest without having to pay capital gains tax. The regulations just came out a couple of weeks ago. The comment period is open, and it remains to be seen how that plays out on the ground. And then the last one is, of course, our continuing support for any kind of funding or legislation addressing the opioid crisis. And now I'd like to turn it over to Niels Tillstrom to talk about our draft 2019 federal legislative and regulatory agenda.
Thank you, Vicki. Mayor, Commissioners, in the 2019 federal legislative and regulatory agenda, we identified 8 priorities, and I should say 8 priority areas, because under each of these items is nestled a number of action items and programs that we'll be supporting. The first 3 are advocating for the investment and enhancements to affordable housing, homelessness, and mental health and addiction programs, and recognizing that these issues are definitely larger than local and state government, and they need a federal response. And in that, the city has worked with a number of different cities extra-regionally along the West Coast and across the country to advocate for CDBG, home partnerships program, the tenant protection vouchers, housing choice vouchers, the emergency solution grants, HOPWA, and expansion of the low-income housing tax credit. And this year, we're going to be advocating for the Section 184 Indian Home Loan Guarantee Program. And the city is also going to be pushing back on challenges to the fair housing rule, the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule that the Obama administration put in place, and then also looking for opportunities to influence regulation to create some more flexibility in the use of resources locally. The next item, which is entitled Portland is a Growing, Welcoming, Inclusive, and Sanctuary City, was an item developed with the Office of Community and Civic Life, and it's focused on protecting the city's sanctuary city values and working with our delegation to ensure that the 2020 decennial census process is a funded process that ensures everybody is counted and is not politicized. The following 4 items are focused on infrastructure, the environment, resiliency, and the potential for a large-scale infrastructure package. We've been working with the Portland Bureau of Emergency Management to ensure that they continue to receive funding through the Urban Area Security Initiative, which is a Department of Homeland Security program that PBEM receives anywhere between $2.5 and $3 million a year, and it's managed regionally. Our UASI is 5 counties and I think 7 different municipalities. I'm probably getting that wrong, but I think it's not just within the city boundaries, and we are also going to be working to secure support for hazard and pre-disaster mitigation grants that the city will be applying for in 2019. With regards to Portland Harbor, we're going to continue to work and educate the delegation and the EPA on the city's priorities within the Portland Harbor Superfund cleanup process and provide examples of the work that's already being done on the site. And in just a few days, 10 days, we are going to be traveling to Washington, D.C. to carry that message. In the 116th Congress, we've spoken about this, we could finally see a large-scale infrastructure package, including the potential for congressionally directed spending, called earmarks, as well as an opportunity to enact policies that could benefit the city's transportation goals, such as potential removal of toll restrictions and the prioritization of Vision Zero cities for federal funding. And finally, the item confronting climate change. It's been 25 years since the city of Portland enacted its climate action plan, and this administration, the Trump administration, took the United States backward in its removal from the Paris negotiations, and I think this is another opportunity for cities to take a step forward, as we've continued to do, to show that we are going to be the leaders in pushing climate policy. So,
Niels, can
Yes.
I jump in? Because we
Absolutely.
want to make sure there's time for the state agenda before we lose a quorum here. And the policy positions that you list, I was struck by the fact that the second to the last, well, no, but number 6 from the end is federal cannabis regulation. And, I was making a note, Vicki, when you were talking about how the new committee structures are going to, who's going to be a committee chair, and I understand Suzanne Bonamici may have a subcommittee in education, Earl Blumenauer may have a subcommittee on infrastructure. But we know that Congressman Blumenauer's also great passion in life is getting cannabis off Schedule 1. And if we do that, then we can start addressing things like the banking system and cannabis and other things. Would it make sense, given the change in leadership at the House, for us to bump up federal cannabis regulation as a higher priority, or is it flagged sufficiently for the work that you need to do?
I think it's flagged sufficiently for the work we need to do. I think it's your decision as to whether the commission, whether you want to bump it up. But I think with the Attorney General gone, who had a specific issue with cannabis legalization or any legislation or regulatory changes around cannabis, there is an opportunity to move something forward.
And I just
At least certainly on the House
my
side.
sense is, and I ran into Congressman Blumenauer on election night, is that he's itching to take another run at getting this off Schedule 1. You know, an increasing share of our local economy relates to cannabis and cannabis sales within our city. It just seems to me that we may want to consider bumping that up to a higher priority to support his work. And who knows, maybe there are enough libertarians that have been elected to the Senate that we have a chance of getting that done.
Absolutely.
Food for thought.
Absolutely,
I'm not.
And Commissioner, one thing about format is we've divided this into priorities and policy positions, but amongst the policy position, pages 1, 2, 3, and 4, they are equivalent. It's not a ranking amongst the policy positions.
Okay.
It's more that they're grouped thematically as best we could.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But we've certainly noted what you've said.
Yeah.
We'll respond accordingly.
So for the sake of time, I can just jump through the policy position themes and then take questions if there are any. The first theme is the protecting local decision-making, and this is about fighting preemption of local authority on issues of right-of-way, local traffic safety laws, internet service requirements, and water treatment. And this item also includes allying with tribal governments to protect sovereignty and ensure self-governance. We've been working with Laura John and the Tribal Relations Program to ensure that there is a tribal lens on all of the work that we do. And so in this agenda, in the federal agenda, you'll see references to housing programs, the murdered and missing Indigenous women's issue, transportation program issues that involve tribal governments having sovereignty over the decision-making that they have for federal aid projects in their reservation lands, and then the Columbia River Treaty. And then the next item is the investing in growing cities and their people. It's an item focused on investment tools, economic development programs, and cultural and arts programs and access to justice. Providing public safety is a group of programs and issues that support victims of violence, as well as supporting programs that are used by our police and first responders. This section also includes the federal regulation of cannabis and cannabis business practices, as well as public health studies with respect to communication systems. And then lastly is the addressing the needs of the environment and built infrastructure. And this item has to do with the intersection between the environment and development within the floodplain and flood protection zones. So the National Flood Insurance Program, we are working with FEMA to understand how local land use and development decisions could be impacted by a biological opinion regarding the NFIP's relationship to the Endangered Species Act, and that's a protracted process that we've been going through. We've discussed the Tryon Creek project, and then we are continuing to support the Levee Ready Columbia project, and then also we'll continue to watch the Columbia River Treaty negotiations as they move forward. So at this point, I'd love to take questions if there are any at this point, but otherwise I'll turn it back to Elizabeth.
Do we know if the state's going after the state opioid response grants that SAMHSA rolled out this year?
Is the question if the city is pursuing SAMHSA grants from
Well,
the
I thought
federal
that
government?
had to
It
happen
goes
at
through
the
the
state
state.
level and then it's distributed, yeah. Sorry, I'm
I
kind
can,
of skipping
no,
ahead
that's
to-
right, I can inquire.
Yeah,
I don't know.
that was the only question that popped up on
Oh,
that item
actually, wait,
for
we
me.
may have, let me phone a friend.
Thank you for your question, Commissioner. Eric Knoll, Associate with the Office of Government Relations. I believe the latest round of grants, the state received about $16 million from SAMHSA. About half of those grants have been distributed to community-based health clinics around the state with an emphasis on rural clinics. The other half is still in the process of being distributed, but we're tracking that as it comes in.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So we'll switch teams here. Thank you, Vicki and Niels. Erica's going to stay. And I'm going to invite up Stacy Cowan.
Good morning.
So Stacy Cowan is our lobbyist and senior associate. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, first work session before City Council. So on the draft state legislative agenda, we actually began this process back in June when we solicited feedback from bureaus and council offices to help build the draft book that you have before you. And we've been researching and vetting concepts, doing outreach, and meeting with partners as we refine this draft. I should also mention a little bit about the context that we're going into, because the state, as you all know, has two flavors of regular session, short and long. We are headed into a long legislative session, so it's 160 days, about 5.5 months. It's a budgeting cycle. The state is on a biennial budgeting cycle, unlike the city, and we will see, well, there has been a sort of open season on bill in drafting, which allows for a large volume of bills to ultimately get introduced at the during the long session, unlike a short session, which has a finite number from the very beginning. So we will see, if the past is any indication, about 2,800 bills going into this long session. And our office typically tracks between 70 and 75%. So we go through and we read every single one, but as far as those that we are continued to monitor through the process, those have been our rates when we go back through Bill Tracker and see the volume that we're tracking. So I think, as I mentioned a little bit before, in order to prepare for this robust long session, we've been doing outreach with partners in government, nonprofit, some in the business sector, as well as with legislators all across the state. We've had several trips to Eastern Oregon, the South Coast, down the I-5 corridor and some of the rural areas there, and have been working with the League of Oregon Cities as well. And that helps determine areas of potential collaboration, do an assessment on the viability of certain concepts, and get a sense of what the broader themes are going to be for the upcoming session and how we can fit into and influence that momentum. So similar to what we did on the federal side, just a quick look at some of the accomplishments over the last two sessions, long and short, to give a sense for where the city's been. So in the 2017 last long session, the city of Portland helped to pass policies that reduce speeds on residential roads, expanded homeownership financing tools, created incentives for seismic retrofits, required residential disclosure of earthquake safety, and also acquired significant new funding. Some was on the housing side through the emergency housing account and the state homeless assistance program, but a lot came through transportation. This was the session where you had the $5.3 billion transportation package. So we'll see up to $110 million going into Outer Powell to update that road and then transfer it to city ownership. There was $1.5 million for Columbia Boulevard, $2 million for Capitol Highway, and cumulatively, up to 2025, the city of Portland will see $200 million in new preservation funds coming in for transportation. So a lot of money came out of the 2017 session, especially around transportation. Now, looking at the short session in 2018, that 35-day session, the office helped pass the constitutional amendment that expanded bonding authority for affordable housing that just passed this most recent election. Also worked on the document recording fee, which will continue to raise $61 million a biennium for housing. And we worked on air toxics through Cleaner Air Oregon and opioid addiction, prescription drug monitoring, and also passed a bill to help catalyze better relationships and partnership between the city and the Oregon Department of Transportation on roadside cleanups and management of people experiencing homelessness on public lands. So, quick snapshot, last 2 years. Let's look at the timeline for 2019. We are currently here on November 15th. the week after next, on Tuesday, November 27th, we will be holding an Advocacy 101 training in Town Hall with Commissioner Fritz and Mayor Wheeler out at PCC's Southeast Campus from 6:30 to 8:30. This is going to be an opportunity for community members to both learn how to work effectively and advocate at the state level, and also learn about the city's draft agenda, provide feedback and input on what they would like to see the city working on. We will report back to council offices on what we hear during that town hall, and also when we are back before you on December 19th, we'll again reiterate what we learn at the town hall. Between now and December 19th, we also have legislative days. That's a time when the committees actually convene down in Salem. This will be the first time the committees will be getting together since the election. We'll have a better sense of sort of how certain bills and big topics are squaring up at that point. Looking ahead to January, we will again hold we'll invite our Portland delegation in and have a breakfast and talk about mutual priorities and areas for collaboration. And then we will rapidly go into legislative organizational days, which are like committee days, but it's actually the informal start of session. We will see bills at that point. And then that will quickly roll into the start of the legislative session. And you'll see here, not that anyone's counting, but we've put in the constitutional deadline for sine die on June 30th. The legislature passed a bill to move up the start time of the session, in part to avoid conflicts with the 4th of July holiday. So we are starting 2 weeks earlier, but there's no give on that front end. So we will see bills, and we won't have the usual 2-week buffer to push legislation out to bureaus and to your office for review. So it will be a really hectic mid to late January. Just going to flag that at this point. So with that, Vicki did a great overview of what happened at the federal level. I think we're all probably pretty familiar with what happened at in the state. The governor obviously won her re-election campaign. Democrats picked up seats in both the House and Senate. Right now, the balance of power will shift to being, or in January, it will shift to being 38 Democrats and 22 Republicans in the House, 18 Democrats and 12 Republicans in the Senate. Those are meet or exceed supermajority thresholds in both chambers. The supermajority is the threshold needed to pass a revenue-raising measure, which is typically another way of saying a tax. The threshold on the House side would be 36, so there's a buffer over there. On the Senate side, it's 18, so they're right at that point. We will have 12 new members in the Oregon legislature, 2 senators, 10 House members. Only one of them will be from the Portland area, and that's Senator Shemia Fagan, who's not all that new because she served 2 sessions in the Oregon House. A couple of broader themes also in looking at what was happening in governor's mansions and state legislatures across the country. We know that Republicans typically possess control over governor's mansions and state houses by and large, if you look at the numbers. Post-midterm, Republicans will control 26 governorships. Democrats will have 23, and Georgia is still too close to call. The more interesting story is at the legislative level, though. This will be the first time in 104 years that the lower and upper chambers of every state legislature except one will be controlled by a single party. So this means that, in my mind, it is an indication and a reflection of the polarization that is happening in our country right now. And Oregon, while we are often an outlier on many things, is certainly in line with this trend. So first time in 104 years where you will have a single party control the upper and lower chamber for every state house except Minnesota, and also Nebraska is a unicameral body with a nonpartisan legislature, which I didn't know.
Do you happen to know how that breaks down along party lines?
So the Republicans will control 30 state houses. Democrats will control 18, and then Minnesota is that split in Nebraska. If you look at this midterm versus the 2010 midterm, Democrats captured control of 7 state house chambers during this most recent midterm election. Back in 2010, Republicans captured over 20 chambers. So there were significant differences. Also, that 2010 would be the year that you would have a decennial census, which then informs redistricting. These things have ripple effects.
Could I just put on the table, one of the interesting ripple effects is given the polarization, given the dominance of single parties in state houses across the country, what that means is fragmentation of the parties within the House.
That's absolutely true.
Right?
Yes.
So that is a dynamic that we will also be navigating, is it's no longer D versus R, it's R versus R and D versus D, and the fragmentation of the parties within, which will create an interesting dynamic.
That's absolutely true, and you're seeing more and more experiments with primary systems as a result of that. So just something to think about as we move forward. The next slide is also, it contains a lot of similar information, but what I want to call out here on this legislative overview is the leadership that's indicated is the prior leadership. House Democratic Caucus just had their leadership vote and are will maintain Jennifer Williamson as the majority leader, and they renominated Representative Kotek to be their speaker. By the time we come back before you on December 19th, we will know what has happened with the other caucus votes. But it is notable, and we have called this out the past couple times we come before you, the amount of representation that the city of Portland has in this leadership, at the leadership level, with both majority leaders representing actually where we are right now, and of course Speaker Kotek representing North and Northeast Portland. So with all of that groundwork, I'm going to turn it over to Stacy to talk about the budget and likely issues that are going to come up in 19.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Mayor Wheeler, Commissioners, Stacy Cowan. I am the Senior Associate on the state team with the Office of Government Relations. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the state budget. So this might be a repeat for folks, but just to help set the context. So the process begins for developing the state budget for the 2019-2021 biennium with agency request budgets, and those were completed in August of this year. The next step is the governor's office takes those requests, they craft their recommended budget. We're going to expect to see that probably early December. After that, what you see is co-chairs of Ways and Means will release their framework. And again, they traditionally build on the governor's recommended budget. We'll expect to see that framework sometime in the beginning of session. And that framework really does shape the work of the subcommittees of Ways and Means and help prioritize the work that they do. The most recent economic forecast was released yesterday. This is the forecast that the governor's office uses to create their recommended budget. So yesterday's quarterly forecast showed a strong economy, but there is a note that there's a potential recession on the horizon. This isn't necessarily a surprise to folks. They have been seeing a gradual slowdown. It looks like it's a couple of years out. The question just remains, how much will it slow and exactly when will it slow, which are difficult things to predict. So the forecast calls for Oregon revenue exceeding the 2017 forecast by $954 million. You'll recall that under Oregon's kicker law, if state revenue exceeds the close of session forecast by more than 2%, the entire surplus goes back to taxpayers. And that's in the form of a corporate tax kicker dedicated to K through 12 education. And then the personal income tax kicker goes back to taxpayers in the form of a tax rebate when they file their 2019 taxes. And just a few more numbers for folks. This is a projected $724 million personal income tax kicker and a projected $230 million corporate kicker. So that's what the numbers are showing us right now. And then a small silver lining, right now Oregon's reserve funds, it's projected to be one of the largest in state history at about $2.5 billion. So depending on what that recession looks like, that will potentially help to smooth out a little bit of some of the impacts that might bring. A couple of budget considerations just to keep in mind as we move forward. So the first is that lawmakers have been working on a plan to fund better education outcomes. They've been holding listening sessions statewide and really trying to do some work to formulate a plan on how do we fund education differently. It's anticipated that this work is going to end with a budget recommendation and then a plan to raise the revenue to fund that recommendation. So that's an important consideration that's definitely going to be something that's prevalent during session. Additionally, there is a projected $835 million hole in the Medicaid budget for the Oregon Health Plan. Obviously, that's an important budget consideration. And then lastly, as I mentioned, the uncertainty and then the threat of a possible recession when we look ahead at the economic and the revenue forecast. So looking ahead at some of the likely issues that we're going to expect to see this session, they're going to include things like the budget, of course, tax reform, education funding, carbon reduction, paid family and medical leave, gun safety, health care, Medicaid, mental health, housing, tenant protections, and non-unanimous juries, which is sort of the topic of the moment right now that's getting a lot of attention, rightly so. What's really interesting too is that you're going to see that there's actually quite a bit of crossover between this list and our priorities, which Elizabeth will go ahead and cover for us now.
So the state agenda, like.
I'm sorry, could I
Yeah.
interrupt? And I apologize if I had to be called out of the room for a moment. On what basis are you saying these are likely issues? Is this from press reports? Is it conversations?
Yeah.
I assume this is something of an informal list.
It's definitely a little bit of looking into the tea leaves, but informed by conversations with the speaker's staff, which obviously speaker's priorities, I think definitely lend itself to the direction of the House caucus. And it's a little bit of kind of gathering the data, looking at some leftover issues from prior sessions, and then again, kind of looking at the tea leaves and projecting what do we think we can expect when we look at supermajorities in both the House and the Senate.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor, can I jump on that for a second?
Sure.
So what we're hearing from the Speaker's office is that two likely caucus priorities are climate and public education. And they've been very clear about those two. That doesn't mean that we're not going to get to a number of these other city priorities, but in terms of the way they're framing their agenda, we're hearing climate and education as the top two. And one thing I was struck by in looking at our state legislative agenda is we don't talk about education. We don't have a placeholder. Now, I don't know whether the focus is going to be on public schools, K-12, or trades, or community colleges, or some combination. I was going to, I have to leave a little early today to go up to OHSU, but I was going to make a proposal, colleagues, that we put a reference to education in our economic development plank as maybe a third or a fourth priority. Just frame it in terms of how important it is to have an educated workforce to a strong economy. So that if that does turn out to be one of the two waves that goes to the legislature, I think we're going to want to be on record because obviously, stable and funding for public education is important to the City Council. So I would urge that we have a placeholder there so that we're able to affirm that if that becomes one of the top two priorities of the Democratic caucus.
So noted. Another theme that came up as the Joint Student Success Committee traveled all around the state that was a little bit of a surprise, and then when you think about it, was not a surprise, was mental health. And the impact that not having an adequately funded mental health system has on our education system. So that's likely to be another issue that will dovetail around education funding.
Could I ask you a question on this? I did notice the mental health, and I'm very appreciative of that. And I see healthcare listed generally. And as we're all aware, homelessness is a significant issue, not here, only in Portland here, but around the state. Mayors are talking about homelessness and pushing an agenda around homelessness. But I don't see addiction specifically called out here as a likely issue. Is that because it's under healthcare or it's conflated with mental health?
Part of it's captured under healthcare and mental health, and we could have also called out behavioral health, which would capture addiction and mental health. And if you flip to the next page, we have our state legislative agenda, which specifically calls out mental health and addiction services.
Yeah, I was just trying to make sure, based on the statement that this came from the speaker and it came from press reports and it came from other leaders, that there is not an explicit desire not to address that issue. Would that be inaccurate? And I believe the governor's spoken about
The
this
governor has
being
put down a
priority.
very bold plan to deal precisely with that issue, to get us from whatever we are, number 5 in the nation from the bottom, to
Mental health?
on addiction services.
Opioids.
My expectation is not that it's not a priority. The way that I'm hearing the conversation is that it will be addressed in the conversations with healthcare and fully funding Medicaid, in the mental health. And then, just as an example, some of the work that the governor released in her action plan around housing specifically talks about having housing and community services work with the Oregon Health Plan around the CCO 2.0 conversation and making sure that it's really being addressed in all of these individual buckets.
And the governor has also been leading a task force on opioids, and we've been actively tracking and engaging in that work as well. And that informed legislation last session and will again inform work this upcoming session.
Very good, cool.
So I may be mistaken, but I am getting the impression that housing and tenant protections have been somewhat deprioritized for the upcoming session. And I'm really concerned about that when I look at the larger list and knowing that stable, affordable housing is essential to healthcare, is essential to mental health, is essential to addiction recovery, is essential to success in education, and also impacts our economy as well as our environment. So, our city is in year 8 or 9 of a housing crisis, year 3 of a declared emergency. It is a statewide crisis. I mean, I'm on my way to Pendleton for the roundup earlier this year. I overheard a conversation in a truck stop restroom, I think in Rufus, about a church opening up shower facilities for homeless people and how they were only going to be able to serve 75 men and 75 women when there were hundreds of people that needed it. And this is in tiny, very sparsely populated rural Oregon. So I'm just concerned about that.
Affordable and stable housing will continue to be a priority for leadership at the legislature. I think part of it is a question of having many, many priorities, which is something that we grapple with at all levels. You will note that on both the state and federal agendas, affordable and stable housing are at the very top. And then coupling that with mental health and addiction services, knowing that these things go hand in hand.
Yeah.
At the top for us,
for
but I'm
us.
talking about what I'm kind of hearing at
Yeah.
the state
Well, I can
level.
tell you at the League of Oregon Cities Board, there was a robust discussion on which should go top, affordable housing and or mental health, but it was very clear that everybody's very concerned about both. So on the next page, they're kind of laid out all the different things that I think a lot of people are still concerned about. So, I mean, the legislators go to every part of the state and they're going to be seeing the problems of both on a daily basis every time they're in their districts.
Yeah, and the fact that is pretty chilling is that Oregon is 4th in the nation in need and 49th in access.
For addiction.
For access to mental health and addiction
Well, I
treatment.
thought we were last in mental health.
No, we're number 2.
Oh, okay, so we're moving on up.
Yeah, you can put the foam finger away. We're number 2 now.
No
not
comment.
to be flip about it, but it's the need is real and immense. And Senator Peter Courtney has been a longtime advocate for mental health funding. We have actually more nurses being elected into the legislature, which bring that
Yeah.
perspective. And especially on mental health and addiction services, we will be partnering very closely with the county, as well as the League of Oregon Cities to help push forward work on protecting existing investments as well as expanding access to services. The items under the affordable and stable housing plank, just to make sure I call them out, it's sort of a soup to nuts approach, right? We're talking about what are policies that help keep people in units through just cause eviction standard and allowing rent stabilization policies. We're talking about financing and funding to build more units through extending the sunset on the multiple unit limited tax exemption, getting additional funding for permanent supportive housing. The governor called out a desire for 200 additional units. We know we need far more than that. And of course, continued investment in the emergency housing account and state homeless assistance program. I think I touched on the mental health and addiction services. The next two items under priorities, healthy environment and resilience. We're talking about infrastructure and environmental issues, capping our carbon emissions and setting a statewide market, and looking at reducing airborne toxics. Part of that will be trying to tap into some of the settlement dollars from VW, the Volkswagen settlement, and helping to fund retrofits of equipment for MWESP contractors here in the metro area. On the resilience side, establishing a retrofit grant fund, a pot of money that can be accessed by both for-profit and nonprofit entities, because we know that private structures impact the public's recovery and life safety in the event of a major seismic earthquake. And if you are a church or a nonprofit, you don't have a tax base to benefit from a tax credit. And so something like a grant fund serves your needs much better. Also supporting Article M&N bonds, which go towards school and emergency service building retrofits, and working with the League on general infrastructure resilience across the state. The next priority is on public safety and accountability, specifically calling out gun safety. There will be a variety of measures on gun safety, background checks, but also seeking additional authority at the local level, because we are highly preempted by the state to regulate in this area. And right now, if someone is carrying in a public space, we can only regulate that activity if the gun is loaded, and if you talk to an officer, they don't know the difference from a distance. Police officer accountability is about when a decision is made by our chief and police commissioner, discipline when misconduct has occurred. When it's in line with our discipline matrix, an arbitrator wouldn't be able to deviate once they agree that misconduct occurred and the discipline matrix was applied correctly. So it increases consistency in the application of discipline. And finally,
Before we move off of
Please.
public safety, where did the auto theft legislation go? I thought that was a priority for us.
it is under a policy position. In talking with your staff, they had recommended its placement there, but happy to follow council's direction to move it up.
Okay, my understanding is Jennifer Williamson will be introducing that legislation, and I want to make sure that we are loudly and clearly on record in vociferous support of her efforts.
And Chair Barker will be also leading the effort on
Great.
that.
And Chair Barker, fabulous.
Noted.
Yep. Final item on the priority list is local funding and authority. This is the do not preempt us. We do a large amount of defense for all of the offensive items that we've listed. Protecting our ability to raise revenue and manage city administration is nearly a full-time job at the state legislature. So we have a number of policy positions similar to the federal. We have grouped them thematically. into, actually, I'm talking over your section. Stacy, why don't you cover policy
You're
positions?
doing great. Do you wanna-
Thank you
I'm
so
just
much.
kidding. We'll give Elizabeth a bit of a break. So we have 7 general themes that we've grouped our policy priorities into. I'm going to go ahead and just list through them. And just a reminder, in your written agenda, there is some additional detail in there. And then, of course, we can answer questions or talk about any of the individual items. So beginning with economic development, we have brownfield incentives. We have common consumption. This is in regards to cannabis. And then we have amendments to urban renewal statute. Under the good government heading, we have the conflict minerals state procurement policy, which is something that this council's taken up. And then we have the non-disclosure of 911 audio recordings. Under healthy families, we have supporting investments to improve foster care, as well as paid family and medical leave. Under safe and healthy communities, we have auto theft, we have violence against Native American women, and we have the safe disposal of medication.
Could I ask you a question under the good governance? And I know we've had a conversation about the non-disclosure of 911 audio tapes, and Commissioner Fritz gave a very reasoned and very passionate reason for that, and I want to stipulate that. Here's a question I have and a concern I have. Oftentimes, the 911 tapes are the only means of accountability in terms of what actually happened. How do we manage? I want to be respectful to her position because I think it was an important stance she took in an important position. But how do we manage trying to be respectful of people on the worst day of their lives and not have them have to read in the press what happened to them? In other words, being re-victimized, but balancing that against the very real need for the police in particular to be able to demonstrate exactly what happened. We get asked for that information all the time.
I was going to say also that I haven't had a discussion with Commissioner-elect Hardesty about this, and since she'll be in charge of BOEC in January, that's necessary. In my mind, Mayor, it needs to be a very carefully tailored, it's not a blanket policy that we need to go for, and maybe what we're going to be asking for is to set up a committee to really take a good look at it and come back with some recommendations. The last time we had this at the legislature, that was kind of the thinking, was it was not ready for prime time. I would expect that that might be the same thing again. On the other hand, I do think it's increasingly dangerous for vulnerable people that, as you say, on the worst day of their lives, the press is going to be broadcasting, which I don't think is good for society in general. I keep thinking, I don't know what's happening in California, but there must be some pretty horrendous 911 calls there. And what I'm finding increasingly on Twitter is that people are not saying, not suitable for work, or this may be, it used to be in the olden days, they would say, this may have disturbing images, and instead it's just plastered right up there, this disturbing image, which I then have to scroll really quickly past to avoid having in my brain for the rest of the day. So that's kind of my thinking on it, if that's helpful.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question about that, actually. If a 911 audio tape is played in a court proceeding, does it then become part of public record, which anyone can at least access a transcript of, if not the actual tape?
Well, currently, 911 audio recordings are considered public record, so they are available.
Okay.
There are some, in my conversations with the folks out at BOEC, there are some statutory protections that they have in releasing audio recordings. They did say, by and large, the majority of them are released to both insurance companies and through the courts. That's the majority of the requests that they get. And just for context, they receive anywhere between 50 and 90 requests a week for public record. Again, by and large, these are from courts and insurance companies. A small number are private citizens. And then about the 50 to 90 a week, so that equals on the low end maybe 2,500 a year. Of those, about 50 of those a year are media requests. And in our conversations, I was informed too, they actually don't do any transcription on the BOEC side of the records. There are some small notes that are taken through the CAD system as a call is coming in, but there's no transcription that happens of audio recordings currently.
And currently, we have some guarantee for victims of sexual assault of anonymity if they come forward. Could their 911 calls presumably be requested and published or broadcast in the media?
So I'm not familiar with the domestic violence protections, and I can go back and look that up. What I do know is that when I talked with our BOEC staff, what they said is they have three sort of areas in which they gauge public records requests. If there's an ongoing investigation, they're protected from releasing those. They don't release recordings if they're if there's a current investigation. They do have some vague language around if there's a public safety threat. And there's a couple of people, there's a staff that pulls the records and then it's passed on to a supervisor to do an additional check. And they did outline one example for me where there was a couple of red flags, and I do believe it actually was a domestic violence situation. An individual was requesting a couple of different recordings. Something didn't quite seem right. They pass it on to a supervisor, and then the supervisor actually withheld part of the recording under that protection of public safety because there was a public safety concern. There is a repeal process. If somebody makes a request and they're denied, they have the ability to appeal. It's not used very frequently.
Okay.
And then the last thing I'll just say, because I've dug into this and learned a tremendous amount, there actually is the ability, most folks don't know this, but my understanding is there is the ability to request anonymity. And I said, does that have to be requested when I call 911? Because understanding most people, if you're in crisis, you're not going to think that. And they said that even retroactively, you could call back in and say, I'd like my information to be kept private. So
That's the problem. I thought that you couldn't do that.
folks do have that ability. What I was told is that most folks don't know that they have that ability to be able to call in. I'm happy to find the statute
Yeah,
and
I'd
let me
like-
share that with you.
Yeah, that might actually address part of my concern.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah. Let's see, where did we leave off? I think we're on the last page. Just real quickly, we'll talk about continuing on through our priorities or our policy positions here. Infrastructure and natural resources. We have the Columbia River Levee Repair and Accreditation. We have collaborative planning for drought resilience. And we have the State Historic Preservation Tax incentives. That's a lot of words there, it feels like. So, transportation, Vision Zero, as well as the new mobility regulatory framework. This, of course, is our TNCs, as well as the autonomous vehicles, or AVs. And then lastly, we have tax and finance, and that's property tax reform, as well as improving the efficiency of tax and finance programs.
Do we know if there's been any murmurs about preempting us on regulating TNCs at the state level?
Yes. Full stop. There were efforts a couple years ago to preempt us on TNCs. That same legislation has been drafted as a placeholder. Apparently, there is a look at tailoring that a little bit, but there's an effort to
Who's
preempt us.
advancing that?
Lyft.
So
Well, who's
can we add that to our, I mean, obviously that's part of Don't Preempt Us.
Yeah.
But it seems like that should be a priority that for TNCs in particular.
And to provide a little bit of context, it sounds like there's some interest in looking particularly at vehicle inspections, background checks, and insurance, thank you, that they've called out those specific areas around, the way that they're framing it is looking at some type of statewide regulatory framework.
Well, if they'd like to set some minimum standards for us, that would be wonderful.
That is
Well, they
exactly
did,
the
but
message
their
we're delivering.
minimums are so
That is the-
ridiculously minimal.
Well, but we can set higher standards, is my point. That's how preemption should be used, to set minimum standards to ensure public safety, and we're protecting the environment, not protecting private industry.
And so we actually call out this in two places in the agenda, both under the priority about don't preempt us and specifically mention transportation network companies there, and then under the transportation policy position, talk about maintaining our authority to regulate and the importance of local governments being able to really address the needs on the ground related to transportation network companies, as well as autonomous vehicles.
So who's introducing this legislation?
There is a committee bill, is my
Okay,
understanding.
committee bill, all right.
It was drafted by Representative McLean's office, I believe. I'm not sure what level of work she's doing or if she's agreed to sponsor the legislation, but her office did get it drafted.
But I
All
think
right.
it's through the committee process, so, the personal bill.
Yeah, I'm not sure. My understanding was it was personal, but we can check on that.
Okay.
Yeah. But again, that doesn't necessarily agree that doesn't necessarily mean she agreed to sponsor that legislation. She helped get it drafted, and just to highlight what Elizabeth said, it largely is a complete redraft of the legislation that was introduced last time, and they have indicated that we communicated that that was probably not the best place to start for us, and they agreed and have agreed to pull together some additional information to give us a sense of what they're thinking about so that we have something to react to.
Well, if anyone could possibly follow up with me before 12:15 this afternoon, I have a meeting that I would love to have this information
I'd be happy to.
lined up for. Thank you.
Commissioner, what's the timeline, or will council be discussing e-scooters before the legislative session? I guess.
I doubt it. I mean, I doubt that's going to come before January. I mean, the pilots ended, we're pulling them off the street, or ending. I think we'll have an announcement next week, kind of the
Okay.
next steps forward.
Because I guess that would also should be on the list of question, is it on the list that they not preempt and particularly they not move forward with things like California's not requiring helmets and things like that?
Oh, boy.
So my understanding is that there will likely be a bill to do something akin to California. It's sort of a matter of preemption and sort of not, because right now the requirement for helmets is a state level requirement, and they're trying to change the requirement to be akin to what the requirement is for bikes.
I think there should be an insurance requirement for the scooter companies, and so if you can have that be along your thinking, whatever they do, because people who ride scooters are greatly at risk, as is local government. That there's nobody else to go after. They're going to come after us for street design or something. And I think the scooter companies ought to be providing insurance to their riders, rather than saying you can't unlock it unless you waive your rights.
Commissioner, that is on the list of items that we are currently discussing.
Yeah, I figured it would be.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So now is the opportunity for any additional comments.
I have a question. So
Questions?
there'll be a number of issues that'll be raised with the League of Cities, and I know that they're speaking of insurance issues. There's some insurance issues that the league is mulling over. I assume this list is not comprehensive. In other words, if it does not make it on this list, this does not mean that we will not be advocating for it. So what is the process should something be added subsequent to us actually agreeing to this?
To make sure I understand your question, let's say we're in the legislative session, a bill or topic comes up.
Yes,
It is not
correct.
pre-vetted as part of the legislative agenda. How does the city decide whether or not to move forward? Our process is we track 70 to 75% of all the bills. That is not going to be entirely captured in the agenda. We will receive feedback from our bureaus, and if we know an issue may be of a particular interest to a council office or offices, we will email you specifically with it and get input. If it seems like an area where there may be conflict among council, we will do that effort, that work to talk to council offices and see if there is agreement, which then would allow the city to weigh in. We really operate from the mindset of consensus and allowing the city to speak with one voice when we go to other levels of government.
Great. And Commissioner-elect Hardesty has been included in this conversation?
That's correct. We briefed her on the draft state and federal agendas, as well as her incoming chief of staff, Carly Edwards. So she's being included in this process, and we'll follow back up with her later this month.
Very good. Thank you.
I think Vision Zero came up during the discussion on the federal level. Could you remind me, that enables us to apply for some additional grants?
It is an array of items. not only seeking funding, but also looking at prioritizing safety. And at the state level, it tends to be more policy-driven, so looking at more ability to regulate speeds, do appropriate enforcement actions, education, that sort of thing. Federal level is more funding, though.
Great, yeah, I think some of the contributing factors to our dangerous streets are outpacing our efforts, and I do think it's important for the public to understand the benefits of being a Vision Zero city as far as those increased funding opportunities, but also to understand some of the limitations placed on us by the state, and that we don't actually own all the roads that run through our city, and therefore cannot make the kind of safety improvements we would like to. So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and even for those roads that we do own, we don't necessarily have authority to do certain design or enforcement steps
Yeah.
as well. So where do we go from here? We will incorporate your feedback from today. We will share what we hear at the town hall and work with your offices to make any appropriate edits from that event, and then we'll look to circulate drafts back to you in early December. Our next meeting together will be December 19th, when we hope for council approval of the agendas, or acceptance of the reports is the technical action. Other than that, I want to issue a hearty thank you to our legislative liaisons and to your offices for your leadership, and also to my team, who's pretty fantastic. So it's going to be a busy 2019, and we're really excited to make a big impact.
Well, busy beats all the alternatives, doesn't it? Great, thank you. Excellent presentation. Anything else, colleagues? Good, well done. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. We are adjourned.